Several months later, 3:28 a.m. later. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. 3 weeks later. The next morning. Meanwhile, many months later. Later that night. Later. The next morning.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Just then. Day 2. 2 hours later. Day 3. 75 years later. The next morning. Opening night. Later. Moments later. 3,000 years later. More moments later. 1 week later. 1 semester later. Tomorrow for sure. 5 hours later. Late again. Eventually. You get the idea. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 1 hour later. Yesterday. 2,000 years later. Many hours later. A few inches later. 6.5 hours later. The very next evening. The next day. Many tic-tacs later. 298 frozen patties later. Flashback. 3 hours later. End of flashback. Epilogue. Later that same evening. Several days later. 72 hours later. Just then. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. The next day. 12 seconds later. The following day. Day 4. 1 extremely annoying shift later. A few moments later. 3 hours later. 1 eternity later. 2 very boring minutes later. The next morning. 3 hours later. 3 days later. 1 shift later. 1 winner later. 1 shift later. 6 hours later.
A few minutes later.
Several bad puns later. 2 weeks later.
1 hour later.
11 minutes later.
70 years later. 5 billion years later.
Meanwhile, 1 little boost to the surface later. 6 hours later. 8 hours later. Montage. 4 to 6 weeks later. By sheer coincidence. 1 minute, 37 seconds later. The next morning. 1 debt to society later. The next morning. 1 pair of pants later. 20 minutes later. 24 hours later. 8:01 p.m. 1 week later. The next day. 1 long angry line later. 5 minutes later. Later. A lot of boring math later. Later. In the void.
Meanwhile,
2 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later. 1 hour later. 8 semesters later. Early the next morning. 2 hours later.
5,000 celebrities later.
3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
2 days later.
6 months later.
Meanwhile, much later. Later. 3 days later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 1 hour later. The next day. 10 seconds later. 4 to 6 days later. 346 minutes later. 4 to 6 more days later. Later. 24 hours later. 48 hours later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. 8 hours later. Moments later. The following Thursday. Soon after. 5 minutes later. 2 hours later. 5 minutes later. 7:59 a.m.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3 weeks later. Graduation day. 3 days later.
1 hour later.
Much later. Many minutes later. Thousands of tears later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 1 pathetic sob story later. 2 hours later. Later. The next morning. Much later. Many unbearable hours later. 7 hours later. 82 kilometers later. Epilogue. A little later. Several song-filled hours later. 3 hours later. A few minutes later. 1 nap later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 1 season later. 2 hours later. Many secret parties later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Moments later.